Hey there, this is Pat Ennis of Ennis Legacy Partners. Welcome to the Exit Readiness podcast. I'm here with co-host Walter Dial, CPA and tax partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors in Bethesda, Maryland. Our mission here on the podcast is to provide you, the business owner, with subject matter expertise on topics pertaining to building transferable or sellable business value, and then for planning your eventual exit from the business. We want to help you build a business that's transferable, and then help you to exit successfully on your own terms and conditions. If you're a small business owner and your chosen exit route is a sale to a third party, then you've probably heard of earnouts, but you might be unsure as to how they actually work and when they're useful, when they're not useful. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. In this episode, the topic, Mastering Earnout Strategies and Best Practices. Our guest, Scott Taylor, attorney and principal at Rutenberg, Dickerson, and Tyson's Corner, Virginia, is with us. He's back again. It's good to see you, Scott. Scott's practice areas include corporate and business law, including entity formation, ownership structure planning, corporate governance and mergers and acquisitions, real estate and tax exempt organizations. And he has tons of years, a lot of years of experience serving business owners in successful transactions. So Scott, welcome back. Good to see you.
Thanks, Pat. Great to be here.
Okay, good. So let's start, fellas. You guys decide who's gonna do this, but let's start with the basics. Describe what an earnout is.
Scott, we'll let you handle that softball.
That's softball, right? Well, so basically, an earnout in general terms is money that is earned by the seller as part of the purchase price post closing, right? So there's an amount of the purchase price that's paid at closing. The earnout comes after closing, and it's subject to certain parameters, milestones, and other metrics that determine when it's paid, how much is paid, and that sort of thing. And principally, what it's designed to do is bridge a gap, often in the perceived value of the business by the buyer and the seller. So if there's a gap in there, the seller thinks it's worth this much, the buyer thinks it's worth a little bit less than that. And so there's a gap there in how the parties perceive the value of the business. And so the earnout is a portion that's designed to say, okay, well, if these things come to fruition, then the buyer's willing to pay for that. And usually it's something that's usually value that the seller thinks is baked into the business that's fairly sure is going to, come to fruition. It just hasn't yet. So they want to capture some of that value. And the buyer, on the other hand, is like, well, I'm a little reluctant to pay for something that hasn't come in. And so let's wait and see if that does come in. And if it does, we'll give you a portion of that in additional purchase price.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. And, Pat, to kind of put it into terms that you like to use and that our listeners may be more familiar with, you always talk about transferable value. And a lot of times business owners, in their mind, their business, they have a value number in their mind. But it's value. It's not necessarily transferable value. So they don't factor in all the little things that we're going to talk about later where earnouts are so useful. So the way I kind of look at it or boil it down, it's kind of a way to bridge the gap between value and transferable value. If it turns out that transferable value really is closer to the value that the seller has in mind, he gets that through the earnout mechanism.
Yeah, so let's talk about, well, you guys can take this wherever you want to go with it, because I know you both just did a presentation on it. So feel free. One question that I think is going to be helpful, though, for you to answer in our conversation here today is, when are earnouts like a good thing for a seller, and when maybe not so good?
Well, Walter, I'll jump in on, yeah. So the, the question of when are they good or when are they bad, it's really more of, to me, it kind of boils down to, I mean, it's always, generally speaking, it's always good, right? If there's an opportunity to, get more of a purchase price, right? I mean, when I represent sellers, obviously I want them, I tend to want them to get as much money up front as they can, and not leave, either something on the table or something to be earned out, because that comes with a bit of risk, right? You don't know if it's going to come to fruition. And so you don't know whether or not you're going to get it. Even if it does come to fruition, earnouts are usually structured in such a way where there's still some risk. Is the buyer going to pay you, right? And what that usually comes down to is like, earnouts are almost always part of the funds that the buyer can use for things like indemnification claims. So there's a bit of risk anytime you have, money coming in that from the buyer of whether or not you're going to get it. So it does come with a bit of, and to my mind, it's a bit of like creditor risk. You're almost standing more in the shoes of a creditor at that point, and so you have to calculate the risk on whether or not you're going to get paid. But it's to my mind, if the seller's comfortable that they're getting as much as they can at closing up front, and have an opportunity in an earnout to get some more, then I think that's a good thing. But it just comes with some risk,
Yeah, and I think part of what you're saying is an earnout can be good in the sense that it may be the only way that a buyer is ever going to agree to somehow pay you what you believe the full value is. Buyers are buying their perceived future benefit stream. So if you believe that, if they believe that benefit stream is less than you do, the only way you're going to get paid for it is to agree to an earnout and see what really happens. I mean, do you see it, Scott, have you seen it where there's a negotiation going on and the two sides are apart and it's the earnout that gets them to get the deal done, or doesn't that happen that often?
I usually the earnout is, I most often see earnouts as part of the initial offer anyway. So it's usually a buyer's going to come with an LOI that usually has a portion of, if that's what they have in mind after they've looked at the financials and done whatever their initial diligence at that point. It's not a full diligence review at the LOI stage, but enough to provide an offer. It's usually part of that offer if there's going to be an earnout, usually. And then it's a matter of, well, how much is it going to be, right? And then it's a push and pull of sort of, we want more up, sellers want more up front, buyers want to pay a little bit more on the earnout, see what happens kind of thing. I have seen it. I have seen it come in later when there ends up being kind of a bit more of a fundamental difference of opinion as to the value of the business. So I have seen it come in at a later time, like, okay, well, let's just satisfy that portion of this with an earnout. And if it comes in, we'll pay you a portion of it. But I usually see it as part of the initial offer. And then it's really a matter of, like I said, the push and pull of how much up front versus how much is in the earnout.
That makes sense. So, Pat, when we talk to as listeners know, a lot of our clients are somewhere between, 2 and 20 million in revenue, something like that for the most part. And usually when we talk about value versus transferable value, it's usually a lot of the problems tend to be those size companies are owner centric. So, one of the times where earnouts are very useful is in that situation because, if the owner is the head sales guy and he's got these lifelong relationships with the customer base, a buyer is going to be very concerned that maybe those customers are so tied in with the owner that if he's no longer the owner, they're no longer going to be a customer. So in that case, if you're buying that company, you'd be foolish to buy it based on historical revenue. You need something to protect yourself in the case that these customers do walk. So that's certainly an area where we see it, and that's a common difference in our type of clients between their perceived value and the true transferable value. I mean, can you think of other situations similar to that, Scott, where you've seen earnouts come into play?
Yeah, I mean, I see it. That is one. That's a very common one, and that's one where there's, meaning that you're essentially talking about a goodwill transfer, right? And that if that's tied up in the owner, either one owner or two owners or whatever it is, I usually see it more in a single owner who's the real driving force behind it, has all the contacts, has all the connections, and they're really the face of the organization, so to speak. There's a real keen interest in that situation to make sure there's a transfer of that goodwill from that single owner to the buyer. I often see it come up in other scenarios where it's, for instance, like government contractors who have a pipeline, and so they have either a lot of proposals in, they have either contracts coming up for renewal that they've got proposals in, they've got other proposals for new work. And that sort of thing, which is where that's probably the second most common place to see an earnout, where the seller is like, I'm giving you a business that has a lot of this stuff baked into it. Hasn't come in as revenue. I can't show it historically, but it's got a lot of baked in things with my pipeline that that if I don't get paid on that, I'm leaving value on the table. So that's that's another common area to see earnout scenarios.
Yeah, and I had a client who their historical business, which they had been doing for 20 years, they were a construction management firm, but their specialty area had kind of dried up because a lot of their contracts were with municipalities, and the municipalities just didn't have the money to continue to build upgrade schools and stuff like that. And they made a huge switch over to healthcare structures, and it was going really well, but they had only been in that line for 2 years. Mm-hmm. But it just turned out that because of the age of the owner and things like that, they were looking to transition the business at that point. So the earnout there was really based on, you don't really have a track record in your new line of business yet.
Right.
So we need to put an earnout in just in case, the 2 years have been great, but that's not a long enough track record just to pay you on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Scott, as you're doing involved with transactions with clients, what type of scenario situation would lend toward no earnout? Because here's one of the things, earnouts with small business owners, as you know, can almost be a dirty word in one sense, because it means, well, two things. They're not going to get all their money up front, but that's one thing. But then the other thing is they're going to have to be an employee most of the time, more than likely, for a period of time, 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. So two things. What kind of situation lends toward no earnout? Because that's what all business owners.
Yeah, that's what they want, right?
That's
yeah.
what they want.
It would, without a specific example doesn't necessarily come to mind. I mean, they're out there, but I think obviously a situation where there's not a lot of goodwill tied up into the owner or owners, right? Meaning it's not reliant on the transfer of this sort of this concept of goodwill, for customers and clients and that sort of thing. And a business that is easily quantifiable, and meaning the revenue stream is easily quantifiable and predictable to a point where a buyer is comfortable. One, there's not a lot of personal goodwill that we have to transition, so that's good. And two, we can just pick this up midstream and just take it over from that. I tend to deal with more service-oriented businesses, so there's always a bit of the goodwill issue, because it's tied up. If it's not tied up in the owners, it's tied up in the employees. And so there's a keen interest in making sure, like, for instance, key employees come over and are happy and want to perform for the new owner on the other side. And there's lots of ways you can incentivize them and all that kind of thing. So in those types of business, a little, there's always going to be a bit of an issue there. But even there, if you can get the key employees to come over, you're more likely to get full value up front. Or as much as you can up front, and less on the earnout piece.
Yeah, and that's why one of the things that in the planning work that we do through the years with owners preparing for this day when they potentially have a transaction is that they do take steps beforehand to lock down those key employees one way or another through some kind of incentive planning, be it actual equity, phantom, or cash, stay bonuses, whatever, so that they can go with confidence to the deal table and communicate with confidence that, oh no, the key employees, they're going to stick around for this reason, for these reasons, what I've put in place. So then what was the other point or question that I had? Do either one of you remember what it was?
I was going to play a little game where I throw out elements of a well-drafted earnout and we get Scott's pointers on each piece. How's that?
That sounds good. Yeah, let's
okay.
go.
So Scott, let's start with the earnout period. What are you looking for? What's normal and what are you looking for, short or long, depending on whose side you're on, I guess.
Yeah, right. It's usually, anywhere from 1 to 5, and it usually ends up averaging about 3 years. And that's probably where it's going to be. I mean, that gives enough time for, the revenue that the seller is hoping to come in will come in. And then that gives enough time for the buyer to see also that the revenues come in and they're willing to pay it. I mean, so it tends to end up being about 3 years. And that's.
Yeah. So, hey, Scott, to that point real quick, this is anecdotal, but it seems like there's a high percentage of folks who don't make it the full 3 years or whatever the period is, particularly if it's 2, 3, or 5. A lot of times they don't make it because that piece of being an employee, when they've never been an employee before, maybe ever, it's not an easy thing. What would you say about that?
Well, and that raises a good point about how the earnout is structured to begin with. If it's an earnout tied really to making sure there's a transition of goodwill, well then, you're going to have that single owner or maybe a couple of the owners. The buyer's going to want to get them under a commitment to stay there for a certain amount of time to make sure they get the earnout, right? Or to make sure that the goodwill transitions to the buyer and therefore then they earn the earnout. So then, you're going to be in a situation there where you're going to have the owners transitioning to employees working for a business that they don't own anymore. And that's always a tough transition. I've never seen that go like absolutely smoothly where somebody in their mind just can automatically switch after being an owner for 20, 30 years to being an employee with somebody else running their business. It does happen. I mean, it does happen. But you can also, a lot of earnouts are structured, that the sellers are entitled to that earnout, whether they're there or not. Now, they may have a certain period of time, like 6 months, maybe a year, where there's almost always that period of time where there's, sort of the consulting period where it's just making sure that the buyer can pick this up and run with it. But, a lot of the earnouts are structured where, it's not tied strictly to the seller owner also being an employee.
Yeah. So an example there might be, okay, the earnout might be 3 years, but it's structured in a way to where the selling owner is only expected to, and only really expected to be there for a year.
Yeah.
As an employee.
That's right. That's right. Now, if they're not going to be there, then of course they also have a vested interest in seeing how things are going. And there's only, because they're not going to be there, right? So if they got a 3-year earnout, but their commitment is only a year, they got 2 years where they're not going to be there and they're expecting payment. Now, there's only so much you can do to, ask for financials, period, that kind of stuff. I mean, buyers just tend to, they really sort of object to having to do that. But, even so, you'd always want to build in something where at least if you get your earnout calculation statement saying, hey, we think this is how much your earnout is, we're going to pay you this, you'd want to at least have access to the books and records that allow the seller to confirm it. But yeah, there is going to be that period of time where they're sort of off doing their own thing, but they still have a vested interest in the performance of the business for those remaining 2 years, let's say. Yeah.
And Scott, to follow up a little bit on what you just said, is there always some type of clause kind of addressing the fact that you want the business run in a, obviously the buyer can run a business the way he wants, but the seller, could be in a bad position if the buyer buys the business and then says, hey, I'm going to get rid of half your clients. Right. So are there provisions discussing that always in these earnouts?
There's always something in there. And it depends on whether it's, whether the controls on how the buyer operates the business post-closing or whether they're sort of strong controls or light controls, right? So the buyers want light controls. They really don't want to be obligated to run the business in a particular way or the same exact way that the seller did or anything like that. So the buyers almost always want light controls. They may say, you may get something that says we won't operate or take action with the intention of denying you an earnout payment, right? So if they try to shoot business over to a subsidiary or something like that with the intent of denying revenue to the company that you're entitled to the earnout out of, you say, well, no, you can't do that. I mean, at least don't do that. Don't defraud me out of my earnout. And that's sort of the light control you get, and that's sometimes that's all you can get, and then it sort of goes stronger from there to where you can try to negotiate even all the way up to sort of consent rights and that kind of stuff. That's rare. That's rare to get, but it can run the gamut, and I've seen them all along that spectrum.
Yeah. And what financial metrics, when the performance metrics are financial ones, what do you usually see? Revenue, EBITDA, those type of factors?
Yeah, it's usually EBITDA because that's a common one and one that most folks are familiar with and can be easily calculated. There's sellers would want gross revenue, less ability to sort of for a buyer to manipulate and run a bunch of costs through. Profit is not something you want to get unless you can control how that profit number is ultimately derived. If you can back things out to drive sort of an earnout profit number. And then oftentimes it can be gross profit, which just is cost, you just subtract out cost of goods sold. But EBITDA is probably the most common for financial metrics. Yeah.
And then if you've got the earnout, say it's like a 3-year period, do you usually see it? You wait till the end of the 3-year period, or are you seeing annual calculations, or what do you normally see?
Yeah, it can run the gamut. Obviously, sellers want more frequent periodic payments to the extent, so they get their money sooner, and they don't necessarily want to wait, for 3 years. But if there's a 3-year earnout, it's usually tied to some sort of annual performance is what I usually see. Some sort of annual performance. It can be quicker turns, and sometimes I have seen it where it's like, let's say, gross revenue thresholds, and you could blow through all of those in a year, and earn the entire earnout. It depends on the performance. It usually doesn't happen like that. But if you say you got to have, if the target on the other side of the deal achieves a certain amount of gross revenue threshold, you get X earnout, and it's paid, within 30 days after it's calculated, whatever that. And then if you meet the next threshold of gross revenue, you get your second earnout payment, and then it's paid 30 days. You could blow through all those metrics, in a year or two, even if the period of time is longer. And those are usually, those tend to be capped. Like,
Right.
We're trying to get you to, let's say, a $10 million earnout. But that's dependent on the gross revenue of the business. Now, if you get all the way through that real quick, even though we're going to give you a 3-year window to do it, well, then you get it. And if you don't make it by the end of 3 years, well, then you lose whatever you didn't earn. Let's say, by the end of 3 years, you got through the thresholds and got up to 7 million. Well, the 3 million's off the table because you had 3 years to do that. So it can run the gamut.
And when you say run the gamut, I guess that also, you've probably seen them both ways, where it's all or nothing, or it's incremental. So it's like, hey, if you don't hit 5 million, you get nothing. Well, if you hit 4, we'll give you 80%.
80%, right? Yeah. I have seen it like that. Yep. And I've seen it try to ratchet down. Sellers obviously want to ratchet it down. Is if we get 3 million, 2 million, or we still get something, and buyers are kind of like, no, it's got to be meaningful, or you're just not going to get even a portion of it. So
yeah. And there's got to be something in there about dispute resolution, right? Because I imagine you see disputes over these things.
Oh, yeah. It's not uncommon, despite the best laid intentions and heavy negotiation up front, to get all of the parameters, examples, everything you can do into the purchase agreement to say, this is how this is going to be done. There are disputes, absolutely. And usually in that regard, most of these deals that have earnouts, I also find that they also have net working capital requirements. So that's the first, net working capital is usually done, 45, 60, 90 days after closing. So that's the first place you're likely to have a dispute in a calculation. So there's almost always a dispute resolution provision in there for that. And then the earnout calculation, or the earnout piece, it usually points to that same mechanism, right? And it's usually, let's appoint an accountant to resolve it, because it's usually a calculation issue. So it would point to that. But yeah, you want to have something in there that will help resolve a dispute, because even if you have to go to arbitration over it or go to court, I mean, that's a long drawn out process, rather than just, hey, have a independent accountant calculate these numbers and tell us what it is, and then we're done, kind of thing. Yeah,
and I really like the agreements that have a really clear mathematical example.
Yep.
This is the earnout. For example, if revenue's 10 million, this is what you get.
Right.
I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and the more different pieces there are, the more that an example helps, because it says, okay, this is included, this is included, this is included, this isn't included, this isn't included. So you have an example of how you're going to actually run through and calculate this. And it's similar actually to like a working capital calculation. It's this is included in current assets, this is included in current liabilities. That's all we're going to do. It's the same thing on the earnout. It's, this is what's going to count, this is what's not going to count. Yeah, I mean, and a basic or a clear example in that is like in a government contracting scenario, is you have your pipeline, and either these contracts in the pipeline come in or they don't. That's pretty easy. That's pretty easy to determine, but the clearer the better.
And Pat, one thing Scott and I were talking about in preparing for our presentation, which I really hadn't thought about, but from the buyer's perspective, let's say you're willing to pay $10 million for a company, but you're going to have to go out and borrow some money or something. Well, the earnout is kind of like your own little financing plan. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, instead of paying 10 million up front and having to borrow money, now maybe you're paying 7 million up front and $1 million a year for the next 3 years. So you're getting to pay that without having any financing costs, and you're even able to use the acquired company's profits to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So it's very helpful, obviously, for the
Yeah.
buyer.
All right, so guys, in the time that we have left, what about best practices and strategies? Because that's in the title of of our episode today. What are some best practices and strategies for sellers when it comes to earnouts?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about as far as the, as far as structuring. So, Scott, correct me if I go off track. But so if you're the seller, you want the shortest possible earnout. If you're the buyer, you might want to stretch it out. If you're the seller, and probably the buyer too, because you want to avoid disputes, you want the metrics to be very clear and concise. In the case of the seller, like Scott said, maybe you want revenue because it's just very hard to manipulate. But hopefully everyone's dealing in good faith. So even like I had a client, they sold their company to a very large company. So the earnout was always going to be hard to figure out because their company was just getting absorbed by this other company. So what they agreed to was the buyer basically said, look, we're just going to apply our current historical overhead rate to your revenue. And that's what we're going to use for your EBITDA. And the seller agreed, number one, because he was already getting more money than he thought he would ever get. He got a real premium on it. So he wasn't that worried about the earnout, but it just made things a lot simpler. Because, like Scott said, what control are they ever going to have over this company's overhead, Mm-hmm. And then Scott made an interesting point when we were preparing that comes to the payment method. So, a seller, like Scott said, he wants the milestones to be frequent and the payout to be immediate. But Scott mentioned, we talked about yesterday, Scott, where maybe you won't get immediate payment.
And there were, and this is not as common, but I have seen it where, and this was unique to a particular transaction, in that the earnout piece, the way it was calculated could resulted in a very significant earnout payment, but the buyer didn't necessarily have all of the revenue yet to pay it, but the seller was entitled to it. Okay, because let's say a big deal came in, and it closed, and it would mean a bunch of money for the buyer because that deal came in, but that entitled the seller to a fairly large earnout payment, and the buyer said, we can't be hit with such a huge obligation to pay you, and pay you, in 30 days or 45 days or whatever it is. So what they did is they structured it as, when that happened, when that threshold was met, the buyer issued a promissory note. And it was a pretty quick pay, 3 years, but they issued a promissory note that would allow the buyer to pay that large earnout piece over a longer period of time. Which was, and again, that's fairly unique because usually the earnouts are based on revenue coming in, so that then means that the buyer has to pay a portion of that revenue that they received to the seller. That situation was very unique, and they came up with what I thought was a pretty unique solution of just saying, well, then issue a promissory note and we'll take the payments over 3 years. I think it was quarterly payments, with interest and all that kind of stuff. So, but that was an interesting arrangement.
I thought the other important and interesting point you made when we were going over the presentation was, if you think about this, Pat, as long as there's an earnout coming to you, if there's any other disputes, like, usually there's like you're indemnifying for certain things. Well, the buyer may feel like you owe him money for that and you don't feel like that. Well, he can just withhold it from your earnout, which forces you to go after him. And, a lot of times it's not worth it. So as long, it's just, common sense. As long as there's money that hasn't been paid to you, you're at risk for receiving it for a different reason.
All right. One more question. We want to help owners be in control of the earnout situation rather than being controlled. So if there's an earnout situation in their transaction, We want them to be in a position where they're actually controlling it more than the buyer is. So what would you say to that owner in preparing themselves and their business so that they can more dictate the terms of the earnout than the buyer?
I think, number one, build a business that requires a minimal earnout.
Yeah, right.
So get rid of customer concentration, get rid of owner-centric businesses, have employment agreements, have renewable contracts or long-term contracts, all a subscription business, all the things that argue against a substantial earnout would be my first point.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes to some of these issues that we've been talking about. There's only so much control. If there is an earnout, there's only so much control you're really going to be able to exert after closing. The only opportunity you have, if there is going to be an earnout, the opportunity you have is to make things, as clear as possible in the purchase agreement. That's where you're going to be able to exercise the most control. And then if there is a period of time where you're expected to be, working basically on the other side of the transaction, working for the buyer, to make sure you have enough authority on the other side, if you have that authority, to be able to run the business the way you have to make sure you get the earnout, if you can do that. But again, there's only so much that the buyer's going to let you control on the other side. And you just have to go into the transaction sort of accepting a bit of risk on the earnout piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, is it fair to say this, that if you want to exit your business in the next 5 to 10 years, and you don't want it, you want to get all your money up front? More than likely, in most situations do end up with an earnout piece. But if you work toward you, the owner, not being centric to the business doesn't revolve around you, strong financial performance, recurring revenue, differentiation, customer diversification, and a list of other value drivers that are going to drive business or drive the value of the business and the transferability of it, then your chances of not having an earnout or not being required to have an earnout are increased significantly. But if you don't do those things, if your business is sellable at all, you can almost be assured that you're going to have an earnout situation.
I think, like Scott said, you really should plan on an earnout. It's just a matter of what percentage of the total sales price. To the extent you can minimize it, you do the things you just said, Pat, but I think you're almost always going to end up with some type of earnout.
Yeah. And to the extent that that a business owner is able to do all of those things that you mentioned, Pat, the offer is almost always going to have an earnout in it, but that gives you the ability to argue against it, to minimize it. Say, no.
And that's my point.
Yeah, right. It allows you to argue against it.
You've got, and so hence, you might have more control over that negotiation than if you have not done those things and put those things in place.
For sure.
Yep.
All right, guys. Any last word before I wrap up?
I don't think so.
No.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, Scott, thanks again for joining us. Great to have you back with us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great to be here.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, if listeners want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Oh, they can reach me at staylor@ruttenberg.law. And my number's 703-717-5000.
Yep, good. And listeners, if you want help maximizing the value of your business or increasing the transferability or sellability of it, or planning for your eventual exit. You can reach Walter at 301-951-9090, and you can reach me at 301-859-0860. If you've benefited from today's episode, please consider liking it and sharing it on social media. Thank you for listening, and until next time on the Exit Readiness Podcast, this is Pat Ennis and Walter Dye.